Today on Public Research, as Syria is transformed by a surprise rebel offensive and the war in Gaza drags on, we talk to Middle East expert Hussein Ibish of the Arab Gulf States Institute about Syria.
Look, it's an impossible choice, right? On the one hand, you have a mafia regime that is absolutely brutal and ruthless. And on the other side, you have Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which began as an offshoot of ISIS.
The roots of October 7th, Gaza, Hamas's true war aims.
So Israel will be a target of Hamas, and it's the subtext of the whole thing. But the main target now of this war is Fatah.
Israel's West Bank conundrum and the state of its regional conflict with Iran.
I think Iran is strategically safer because Iran does not possess a conundrum like the occupied territories. Iran can always just cut the crap and go back to being a normal country and trade, and it'll be fine. It doesn't have an internal contradiction that's almost unsolvable, but Israel does.
All this and more on today's edition of Public Research. Just a quick note, this discussion was recorded on December 6th before the fall of Damascus in Syria. So we've had a wide range of people on the show since October 7th. I bet people Daniel Seidemann.
No, I know him. He's great. He's like my spiritual leader.
I know, he's great. But we had David Wormser. I don't
know
if you...
David Wormser, yeah.
Yeah, so we...
Interesting guy.
Yeah, trying to get across...
Yeah, those are very different points of view.
So I want to introduce you. When it comes to Israel-Palestine, I'm always looking for people who aren't shouting, reasonable people, level-headed people who I can trust. And that's the rarity. And I count you as one of those people. If I hear Hussein Ibish saying something, I take that seriously.
Well, I'm probably not shouting, that's for sure.
But I think you're a very fair, honest observer. Yeah.
Well, I try. First of all, I think I try to be honest, and I think that's a minimal benchmark for me. If I see somebody making up a bunch of lies to bolster their case, I'm moving right along. Put it back in your pocket and move on. Now, if you're spinning things, if you have your own interpretation that I think is not right, now we can have a conversation. But there's that bright line between people who make up stuff and people who don't make up stuff.
Most of my questions were not going to be about Syria, and they still aren't. But I would be remiss.
Sure.
I would be remiss if I didn't bring up. I mean,
I'm a Syrian citizen, so I have to talk about Syria.
I knew that. I was going to ask about that.
Yeah, not a lot of people know it because I'm Lebanese and American, but I've been a triple citizen since I was, the first week of birth.
When were you last in Syria?
Oh, God. More than 20 years ago. I couldn't possibly set foot there now.
Well,
it'd be a goner, because I'm Syrian. So, the department would not be, entertained on that basis. They would say, this guy's ours, and,
So what's so amazing is I might have tweeted like a year ago or something. I was like, is the Syrian civil war still going on?
It wasn't really.
Yeah.
It was in a stasis.
Yeah.
With the Syrian government having secured back in 2017, 2018, and almost completely by 2019, control over almost all of what it had deemed back in like 2013, 2014, when they were starting to lose the war really badly, necessary Syria, which is a big swathe of the country, beginning in Latakia up in the northeast coast, the heartland of the Alawite community, which is the bedrock of the regime, going sort of through the central part of Syria down to the Lebanese border and near the Golan Heights. And that was deemed necessary Syria. It includes all of the Alawite homeland. It includes the major cities, Damascus, Aleppo, Hama, Homs, etc., and the areas that the regime felt they couldn't live without. That if they lost those, their control of the country was really in question. Whereas if they lost control of Idlib province in the north, or the areas that the Kurds have established an autonomous zone they call Rojava, or places like that that are sort of marginal from the point of view of the regime, not necessary, right? That they could live with that as a temporary situation a lot better than being overthrown. And that was control of the parts of the country that mattered the most. And so that was the case until about a week ago, when Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, backed by Turkish militias and some others who remain murky, sort of burst out of their redoubt in Idlib province and swarmed and immediately won a stunning victory in Aleppo and moved on to take another smaller city called Hama, which was a traditional bedrock of the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria. And there had been a famous massacre when the Muslim Brotherhood took over Hama briefly in the 1980s. Hafiz al-Assad was extremely brutal in his reconquest of Hama. And it became kind of this mantra of the Hama rules, or the Hama approach to things, which meaning basically a mafia style approach. It's like, the Ba'athist regime in Syria is kind of like Michael Corleone. When Tom Hayden asked him, "Do you want to kill everybody?" He says, "No, I don't want to kill everybody, just all my enemies." And that's sort of the approach. So it's like, something like 10 to 15, possibly up to 20,000 people were killed in the reconquest of Hama. So Hama has fallen to Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and the others who are fighting with it, but it's basically HTS. And now Homs is being, which is a larger city. It's smaller than Aleppo, but bigger than Hama. If they lose Homs to the opposition, then the Syrian regime will be in the biggest trouble that it's been in since 2011. It'll be in the worst conditions since the uprising began way back when the Arab Spring was going on. And it's going to be a really interesting development.
First, I want to ask what you make of these there's tweets, and thanks to Elon Musk, who destroyed the blue check, tweets aren't as valuable about knowing what
I think X is a cesspool of hatred and vile disinformation. I only stay on it because I think it would be really bad for my employers if I got off. I have almost 40,000 followers, and it took me a long time to build that, and it does get attention to something, so I keep it up. But I pay more attention to my little Blue Sky account because it's not a cesspool of mierda.
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask, what do you make of these claims that Assad has
left Damascus? I don't believe it.
You don't believe it yet?
No. Okay. No. Why would he go? Where would he go? No, he would. It would have to be the opposition offensive would have to be far more developed than it is before he would do that. I mean, he might have gone somewhere on a trip. He might have gone to Iran or to Russia to beg for more help. But the idea that he has fled the country, like Idi Amin or something, or Duvalier, or something like that, no. I don't see that as necessary. And he will only do that as a last resort, right? And I don't see that we're nearly at that stage. Right now, Damascus is not threatened, right? And even if Damascus were threatened, the Assad regime, the Shabiha and their cronies, their mafia, they could take refuge in what was attempted to be formed as an Alawite state in the 20s. The French were kind of toying with taking Syria, that the mandate of Syria that they had sort of got through the Sykes-Picot Agreement and then actualized by the League of Nations, where the British took Palestine and Iraq, and the French took Syria, Greater Syria, They were going to break up Syria into three parts: a Lebanese state based on Maronite Christians and Sunni Muslims. That happened mainly because the Lebanese had it in them to make sure that it did happen, and a rump kind of Syria state, but also an Alawite state in the north, based around Latakia. And the problem was that the Alawite community was not united enough, and there were too many Sunni Muslims especially Latakia, the would have been the capital, had a large Sunni majority in it in the 20s and 30s. So there is while the Lebanese project worked, the Alawite project didn't work. But instead, what happened is the Alawites, being a favored minority, a kind of compact minority, I believe they call it, in mandatory Syria and colonial Syria, became very big in the military. And so Hafez al-Assad was able to rise in the Air Force, was able to perform one of the mini coups, but his coup, which he called a revolution, stuck. And that is the regime that has ruled since then, since the 60s. And that regime is essentially a means for the Alawite community with allies, with mostly Sunni and Christian allies in the cities, Sunnis in the cities, not in the countryside, but some Sunnis in the cities, and a lot of Christian support as well, and some Druze support too. I mean, they have a coalition behind them, no doubt, to rule over all of Syria. So instead of getting their own state, they got control of the Syrian state. But where that leads in the long run, if they're riding a tiger, right? If they fall off the tiger, they can get eaten. So anyway, the point is he can always take his people and forces into the redoubt of the Alawite area and the port of Latakia, where there is a Russian naval base, a Russian Air Force base, a Russian signals intelligence center, and where there's a lot of means of protection. So, I mean, I think the worst case scenario for al-Assad would be fleeing into Latakia and having a tiny little, sort of like redoubt. And this would be associated with the increased fragmentation of Syria, where you would have a Kurdish area in the north and a kind of like Islamist areas in different places, and probably other kinds of areas in other places. And who knows what the Israelis would do, create a big buffer zone around the Golan Heights. So that would be another part of Syria gone, and just a complete fragmentation of the country like Iraq, or worse than Iraq.
That's fascinating. So in a way, we could end up with a situation where you have Assad around Latakia, almost like HTS was in Idlib, right?
Yeah, that's exactly. Yeah, you have a province, you control it, but that's all. And you claim you're still the government of Syria, and indeed, a lot of countries will recognize you and do business with you, like Taiwan. We kind of like Chiang Kai-shek in Taiwan, right? Except not an island, right? A kind of almost, it's not a peninsula, but a province, and ruling, claiming to be the government of all of Syria without controlling much of Syria. That, as Chiang Kai-shek managed to do, you can still have a lot of the world continue to recognize you as the legitimate government of wherever it may be. Even the Yemeni government, right? The official government of Yemen, which sits at the UN and represents Yemen and whatnot, and controls only small parts of northern Yemen, doesn't control any part of southern Yemen, and most of northern Yemen, or at least the majority of it, big majority of it, is controlled by the Houthis. But still, the official government is the official government, and internationally recognized. So that's my point.
Let's say that Assad, I don't know, let's say he dies. And this
well, he's a young man, so I wouldn't count on him dying of natural causes anytime soon.
What I'm saying is, if this HTS, and it's so complicated, there's all these different, let's just say the rebels, if they took over the whole country,
well,
is that
let's say let's simplify this a little bit. Let's say they take Damascus, right? Mm-hmm. Take control of the capital city, and they become the government, Taliban style, right? Mm-hmm. Let's say that. Yes. Then what?
Well, my question would be, is that good, bad for Syria?
No, it's bad. I mean, look, this is Alien versus Predator.
Right.
Whoever wins, we lose. I mean, that you
Right.
remember that movie? You know,
Yeah.
it's become this stupid subheader that's just become applicable all over the world. You know,
Yeah.
whoever wins, we lose. And yeah, so I mean, you've got look, it's an impossible choice, right? On the one hand, you have a mafia regime that is absolutely brutal and ruthless. And it's like having Michael Corleone as your president. Absolutely like that. Imagine Michael Corleone at his worst running your country. There you go. You have the Assad regime. And by the way, when the father was in charge, the father was way smarter and more adept than his son, Bashar al-Assad. His father, Hafiz al-Assad, was really smart, very strategic. He's one of the smartest uh, strategic thinkers in modern history of the Middle East, in my opinion. I mean, I detest the guy, but this was a really super smart guy, in my view. And under Hafiz al-Assad, there was a robust mafia organized crime in Syria connected to the regime. But during the father's rule, the state used organized crime, used the mafia for its own benefits. And under the son, it got flipped. So now organized crime, Alawite Sunni organized crime, use the state for its purposes. And it's exactly the other way around, which is kind of disastrous. So on the one hand, you have this mafia regime, really, you know, run by the mafia, with all the, you know, brutality that goes with that, torture, murder. You can't breathe, and terrible mismanagement. Everything's corrupt. Everything's based on, you know, it's like The Sopranos running a country, right? Really, you know. And on the other side, you have Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which began as an offshoot of ISIS, right? And then it became a kind of a subordinate group to Al-Qaeda, right? Jabhat Nusra, the Nusra Front. And then it got rebranded as it kept moving towards the political center. Oh, I mean, and you begin with ISIS, you know, I mean, you know, you're way the fuck out, excuse my language, you're way out there. And you're coming closer and closer into the realm of normalcy. But you're still way out there. And they ultimately broke with international jihadism and have tried to paint themselves as moderate, which I don't believe. I still think they're very extreme in their Islamist attitudes, and they would impose maybe not a Taliban-style state where girls can't go to school and things like that, but a really strict pseudo-Islamic state, because this literalism is only one very weird and very modern interpretation of Islam. It's not historically correct.
There's something comical about the phrase "reformed ISIS." You know?
Yeah, exactly.
It's like I'm Jewish, but I'm reform. It's like we're ISIS, but we're reform. Yeah,
sure.
Yeah.
So the other thing, though, that I do take them seriously on is their claim that they're not internationalists, right? I think that's right, and I think that's genuine, and I think it's strategic and ideological. I think they really did break with ISIS, and I think they really did break with Al-Qaeda. They fought with Al-Qaeda. I mean, the break is not theoretical. They've killed each other in, you know, significant numbers. And the reason for this is that there is a new phase in the Sunni Islamist, and especially like what is called the Salafist jihadist movement, the kind of like super extreme, beyond Muslim Brotherhood, terrorist, totally fanatical kind of Sunni Islamism that I'm talking about here, where the whole thing was born really in Afghanistan during the war against the Soviets, right? And so you had all these Arab Afghans, including bin Laden was one of these people, who had gone to Afghanistan to fight or be administrators or something with the people who became the Taliban, and also the people who became the Northern Front, with all the kind of like opposition to all the Muslims who were opposed to the Soviet-backed government in Kabul. All right, so what happens is the Afghans win, the Soviets retreat, and that's the proximate cause for the downfall of the Soviet Union. I mean, it's not the main reason, but it's the proximate cause. It's like the last straw for them, and they go pretty quickly after that. all these Arabs go home or back to the Arab world anyway. They generally leave Afghanistan. Very few hung around, really few. And they went back imbued with a bunch of ideas. Number one, that Ayatollah Khomeini showed that Islamism can win in countries and overthrow very strong, very deep-seated regimes that look, immovable, but they're not. The downfall of the Shah shows that. And that the victory against the Soviet Union shows that Sunni Islamists can win too. It's not just Shiite Islamists who can win. We don't have, you don't have to become a Khomeiniite, which is not possible for these guys. It's completely not transferable to a Sunni ideology for reasons that would bore your listeners to death. But they concluded that they could overthrow their governments and institute a kind of Islamic state in their country. So the biggest example of this was the civil war in Algeria in the 1990s, which was extremely violent, extremely brutal, extremely prolonged, and in which tens of thousands of people died, massacres by both sides all over the countryside, in the mountains, what have you. Ultimately, the government won, because ultimately most Algerians didn't want that kind of government. And they were willing to stick with a pseudo-socialist Cuban-style state rather than this, insane Islamic fanatics. And the Islamists became radicalized by their own war. So they began relatively moderate compared to what they became. In the end, the Algerian Islamists who were left fighting became so radical, they performed something called takfir, meaning excommunication of the whole country of Algeria. They said, okay, you're all not Muslims. You're all, takfir it's one of the words used for these groups, these like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, these guys I'm talking about in the normal Arab world is takfiri, because no one else does this, right? Everyone else, even the Muslim Brothers would say, that's for God. One Muslim can't look at another Muslim and say, oh no, you're not a Muslim. I know, and you're not, and therefore you're worthy of something bad, including maybe death or whatever I want to do to you. It's okay. And, this in no way is acceptable, because how can you know what someone really thinks? You can't. You mind reader all of a sudden. This is like blasphemous, because it is absolutely the role of God on Judgment Day, according to the religion, to judge people on their morality and their adherence to the faith and their worthiness of salvation or what have you. This is the idea, the traditional Islamic idea, that only God can judge those things. So these guys come along and do this thing. So calling them takfiri is one of the best ways of distinguishing all these guys from everybody else. Because a very, very small group of fanatics who would do this. So the Algerian Islamists were so extreme, they pronounced at the end of the war, they'd become so extreme, they pronounced this on the whole country, twice at least, if not more than that. So they became very extreme, but they were defeated. What happened after that is bin Laden ended up being kicked out of Yemen. And then they wanted to take him to Saudi Arabia, but the Saudis didn't want him. They'd already stripped him of his citizenship and all this stuff. They say he's not allowed in the country. Then the Saudis said, well, we'll take him on condition the Americans will take him from us. Like, we'll take him and then give him to the US. And the US said, absolutely not. So nobody would take him. So he ended up in Afghanistan, and he started writing this crap about the far enemy. Like, we have to defeat the West. We have to attack the US. We have to forget about the local stuff. We have to go after the West. We have to drive the infidels out of the Middle East. Then we can overthrow our governments and do whatever it is we want. But as long as the Americans and the British and the French are around here, we're not going to get anywhere. So that's who we have to attack. And then Ayman Zawahiri, who is the current leader of Al-Qaeda, who is the head of the Egyptian Takfiri movement, went to Afghanistan, and they joined forces and merged their operations, and we have Al-Qaeda as it has been since then, more or less. And that kind of strategy of attacking the far enemy with its apex on 9/11 failed dramatically. right? Because it didn't lead to anything but defeat after defeat for Al-Qaeda. So comes ISIS, which has its own, which grows out of Iraq and Syria. And I'm not going to bore you with the story of how ISIS grew out of Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia and anywhere. But
it's not boring. It's not
well,
boring.
it would be. Let me
Yeah,
just
yeah,
say,
yeah.
yeah, the war in Iraq resurrected Al-Qaeda. We punched ourselves in the face a lot since 9/11 by invading Iraq and then by hanging around in Iraq. One of the things we did was we crushed Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. By getting expelled from Afghanistan, they really lost their credibility. They were kind of dying. But no, we decided to resurrect them by backing really horrible sectarian Shiite regimes like Nouri al-Maliki in Baghdad, and provoking the Sunnis to the point where AQAP, Al Qaeda in Mesopotamia, basically. No, sorry, it's not AQAP. It was Al Qaeda in the land of the two rivers, Bilad al Haramain. Sorry, Al Bahrain. Yeah, Al Nahrain. Yeah. Um, Bilad al Haramain would be Saudi Arabia. It's hard to keep these crazy ideas. They never want to use the name of the countries because
Right.
they don't want any countries. They
Yeah.
want to all the countries, which is one of the reasons
Yeah.
why it's been really hard to convince most Palestinians to even consider joining Al Qaeda or anything like. Because they're very nationalistic because they've never
Right.
had a, they really want one.
Right.
So even like the Hamas guys are like, no, we want a Palestinian Islamic State. So my point is this: they then decided to do something different. ISIS decided to try in transnational caliphate movement. So it's not international jihadism attacking the West. Instead, it's seizing parts of Western Iraq and parts of northern and eastern Syria and destroying the border, literally bulldozing all the border crossings and creating this sort of ISIS mini state in Iraq and Syria, based in Raqqa, and so that failed. So my point is that the two trends since the end of the Algerian War and the birth of Al Qaeda, transnational jihadism aimed at the West, failed. And then the second, the regional caliphate idea of ISIS, that has failed. So what you get now from the Taliban in Afghanistan and now from HTS in Syria is where it's like Back to the Future. We're back to the early 90s when it comes to the Sunni Islamists. Now they want to be very clear that they are not regional, they are not international, they are not transnational, they are only interested in seizing power and ruling in their own country. They both promise moderation, the HTS much more than the Taliban. I still don't believe them in that. I mean, that they really have a heavy lift to prove that that's the case. But we'll see how they run Aleppo and Hama now. I wouldn't want to, frankly, be living there. Just to conclude, this is the new trend, right? It's nationalist Islamism, nationalist Salafist jihadism,
Right.
which was the case in the 90s. So we're post Bin Laden. So I'm going to be explaining all of this in articles. Stay tuned, read.
It's fascinating stuff. And by the way, anybody who thinks Islam or the Arab world is some monolith, they should watch clips of Arab television, which are fascinatingly actually diverse.
Oh yeah. Well, so
Yeah.
here's the thing about Islam. Both the Islamophobes and haters of Islam and Muslims and the sort of would-be communal leaders of whatever stripe, usually they're, religious reactionaries, but they can be more extreme or less extreme, but usually they're pretty reactionary and right-wing, socially conservative. They both say the same thing, which is Muslims think da 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 da, or Muslims do da 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 da. Muslims are da 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 da. Well, look, if you take atheism off the table by saying that, look, you believe in God in order to be a Muslim, okay, fine, I'll accept that. But if you start thinking about, if you look at history and also current realities, and the fact that at least 1 in 5 people on Earth is a Muslim, I can tell you that almost anything you can think of that is in the human experience is present in Muslim societies, not in a corner underground or we have some, but openly done in one way or another. Just say Muslims don't drink alcohol. Muslims don't eat pork. Oh, sweet summer child. Muslims are against homosexuality, against pederasty, against all these. Yeah, I mean, sure, in theory, but if you go to certain places, you will find that open public transgender stuff is baked into the local culture. Doesn't have anything to do with Islam, but it's part of that Muslim society as a social, with Islam as a social text, right? And it's woven into socio-cultural religious so that you can't tell the difference.
Yeah.
And my point is merely that everything is there somewhere. And, I remember I was at a conference somewhere and this would-be leader of the American Muslims started saying, there is only one Islam, there is only one Islam. Maybe in your view, if I were to take you seriously, okay, in heaven, sure. All right, maybe according to God, that's true. All right. But here on earth, there are thousands of Islams as a social text that look nothing like each other in many ways. And that would offend you greatly or please you greatly, depending. And get the hell out of here with your authoritarian crap.
I had a funny
We are not friends.
I had a funny experience recently. I was in Skokie, Illinois.
Oh,
I don't know if you've been there. But
I've been there. Yeah, I've been there.
I was listening to some I forget who, but they were talking about how Jews and Muslims, they can't coexist. and I was in Skokie, totally peaceful. Has a huge Orthodox Jewish population.
It's mostly Jewish. That's where the Nazis had a march in the
issue. It also has it has a lot of Muslim.
Yes.
Yeah. Or in Rogers Park on Devon. Right. Orthodox Jews and Muslims live side by side. And
look, man, Nazis conquered a lot of countries and ruled a lot of countries in Europe directly, not indirectly, like Sweden or something, but directly, with German troops on the ground and Germans making the governing decisions in that country. And of those countries that were ruled by the Nazis, only one had more Jews after the war than it did before the war. The Jewish population went up considerably in Albania, a Muslim majority country, because the Albanian Muslims absolutely refused, as a matter of principle, to distinguish the Jews from the Muslims. And the Nazis were absolutely unable to determine who was Jewish and who was not Jewish.
Wow.
And this is a deep history that people can easily read about. It was a cultural practice that came like that to the Albanian Muslims. You had a different experience in North Africa, right? Where in some cases there was cooperation with the Vichy regime in France and other things like that. There were also a huge number of North African forces in the Free French that retook France, and 100,000 or something like that died in the liberation of France and the liberation of Belgium and Germany. But you have a very mixed record here, but it's still bizarre to hear people say things like that. And all it reflects is ignorance. Yeah. That's all it reflects, just a lack of knowledge. Yeah. Fundamental lack of knowledge.
I want to move to this conflict between Iran and Israel. This is sort of crude. But if the conflict between Israel and Iran, let's say, was some kind of sporting match, and the total points were 100 maximum, and it's halftime right now.
Yeah.
What does the scoreboard read?
At the moment, strategically, it reads, I would say, I'm going to do it in soccer terms, okay? Because that's the sport I understand the best. Does that work for you?
Sure.
Okay, I would say it's Israel about 6 and Iran 1. Iran is very much on the back foot. It's in a horrible strategic situation. It's in order to prevail strategically, it's going to have to make a huge comeback in the second half. It's down by at least 5 goals, so I'm saying it's 6-1. And teams have come back from that, and Iran is not finished. But vis-a-vis Israel, it's in a desperately bad situation. The only thing that they really have going for them at the moment is, first of all, the fact that as the rise of HTS in Syria shows, and as we were discussing, like how can you possibly pick in moral or political terms between Assad and these fundamentalists, savage fundamentalists, between the mafia and savage fundamentalists. What kind of choice is that, right? Would you rather have cancer of the spleen or cancer of the brain? I don't know, good luck. You still have the point being registered that simply weakening Iran and Hezbollah does not make for a more stable or peaceful Middle East. There are other forces that will fill the gap, that nature and politics abhors a vacuum. And if you take somebody out, somebody else comes in right away. And so you weaken Hezbollah to the point that it can't play the role in Syria that it did in 2016 and 2015, late 2015 through 2019. And Russia is busy in Ukraine, and Iran is very afraid of doing anything right now. It wants to do the least possible, and it's also in bad shape. Has lost its air defenses, such as they were, bad Russian missiles that didn't really work, but they're blown up by Israel. The S-300s around Tehran, around the oil fields, and around the nuclear facilities. So they're wide open. I mean, they have no air defense at the moment. So, they're in pretty bad shape. On the other hand, I mean, the Israelis, it's not, if it were a scoreboard about who is strategically safer in the long run, I think Iran is strategically safer because Iran does not possess a conundrum like the occupied territories. Iran can always just cut the crap and go back to being a normal country and trade, and it'll be fine. It doesn't have an internal contradiction that's almost unsolvable, but Israel does, right? Israel is a state that is completely incoherent at the moment. If you ask them to define their borders, they can't and they won't. Why? Because they want all this land in the occupied territories, especially in the West Bank. They will not give it up, but they have no means of dealing with the fact that there are 6 million Palestinians living there, and they've been ruling over these people since 1967. And we live in a world of states and their citizens, even oppressed citizens, right? So my point is that even a Uyghur in Xinjiang province, really oppressed and abused by China, is still a citizen of China. They can join the Communist Party. They can get some power. They can have a voice. A Tibetan, same thing. If you want to play in the system, you can. In fact, there are Tibetans with political power in Tibet and even beyond in China. They're there. Ditto with Muslims in India. Ditto with I really can't think of another example where there are millions and millions of people who have no citizenship, no government of their own, no access to the government that rules them, no path to a voice, nothing. They're outside the whale completely. Like I said, I mean, there are a lot of peoples without states, right? And there are lots of oppressed people in the states that exist. In the countries that exist, there are lots of oppressed minorities. And in a couple of cases, oppressed majorities, like Bahrain, for example, has a Shiite majority that's large, in some ways, oppressed. My point is this: the Palestinians are outside that whale, and it's a problem that Israel doesn't have an answer to because it won't give these people citizenship and a vote. It just won't. It can't. It won't. And it won't allow them to have a state. It won't. It can't. It won't. So the answer since 1967 has been effectively apartheid in the West Bank, where Jewish settlers live as Jewish Israelis under Jewish law, under Israeli law, with the protection of the state and all the rights and responsibilities of citizens. And the Palestinians who live right next to them are under martial law with no state, no passport, no nothing. And while there is certainly discrimination against the 2 million Palestinian citizens of Israel, and even we've just found another case today, this guy filed it, he's being detained without charges for 6 months. And on the same day that the justice minister said, I'm going to keep this guy in prison without charges for 6 months, right? Even though the case against him has been dismissed, there's no evidence against him for any of the things he's accused of. He's just going to sit there in administrative detention. On that same day, he issued a policy statement that no Jews will ever, no settlers to engaged in terrorism will ever be subject to administrative detention. So a settler in the West Bank is free from the threat of administrative detention, but a Palestinian citizen of Israel sitting in his own town inside Israel, not in a settlement, not in the West Bank, in Israel, supposedly his own country, can be and currently is being subjected to detention without any evidence whatsoever for the next 6 months at least. There is a lot of discrimination in Israel, but in the West Bank, it's outright apartheid. And a lot of Black South Africans have said that in some ways it's much worse.
I just attended a talk, I don't know if you know him, by Rabbi Eric Asherman, formerly of Rabbis for Human Rights, but he's a guy who goes to the West Bank and tries to defend Palestinian olive farmers.
Yeah,
by being there, he's been stabbed.
Oh yeah, no, I know people like that. I mean, I knew Jeff Halper of the Committee Against Home Demolitions, who used to go and try to prevent Palestinians from having their houses bulldozed on a regular basis in the West Bank, and he would go and film it and try to stop it and what have you.
He told us that the situation in the West, and he's been doing this for decades.
Yeah,
he said it's worse than ever before.
Oh, definitely. Well, see, you got to understand why, right? So there are these two ministers who are, basically Jewish Nazis, as far close as you can get. Openly racist, openly bigoted, they're clear that in their minds, Jews are simply better human beings than Arabs. It's as simple as that, right? Like their ambitions, and they'll say this openly. I'm sorry, they're in a debate with an Arab citizen of Israel. They go, no, my freedom of movement, it trumps any of your rights whatsoever. Any rights you may think you have, you don't have because it's inconvenient for me, and that's it. So I win. So, anyway, they are Bezalel Smotrich, who's the finance minister, and the minister of security, national security, Itamar Ben-Gvir. And these two guys were kept out of the war cabinet and kept away from the Gaza war because they're completely crazy. And similarly, they were kept away from the Lebanon war. Now, to as a sop to them, right, to make them feel better, because Netanyahu cannot live without them. They are the key to his coalition. And if without the coalition, he's in grave danger of going to prison for corruption. They're slow walking his case very carefully. And they say, the judicial system says, well, we're not going to pursue a prime minister much under time of war. We're just not going to do it. So as long as there's a war going on and he's prime minister, they're going to slow walk that case as much as possible. And really, really, it's not really an immediate threat to him at all. So, it's kind of like Trump, who, needed to win to stay out of jail. So listen, no. My point is that these guys were put in charge of the West Bank. Okay, these two guys, the craziest two people, and they armed the settlers. They sent the army in a completely pointless way to attack these armed youth gangs in Jenin and Tulkarm and other cities in the West Bank. They've been doing their best to make life miserable for Palestinians and to provoke a fight. They want an eruption of violence in the West Bank, which they will use either to conduct the annexation and ethnic cleansing that they want to do, or to get Israelis more ready for the day when it comes. Because it will come, the day will come, and it will undoubtedly be on the grounds of national security, and it will be done, it was the last thing we ever wanted to do. We cried and we didn't want to do it, but someone has to be the grown-up here. We had to do it. We had to draw a line. us over here and them over there, and it's the only way. In fact, it's good for them. We did them a favor. And if more of them ended up over, somehow got over the other side of the line, all for the better. It's good for them. It's good for us. We had to be the grown-ups. We had to bite the bullet. This was very painful. That's what they'll say, right? And I think at a minimum, they want to prepare Israelis for that day, because most Israelis are not aware that that's virtually inevitable. I think most Israelis are not aware of that.
When you say we had to draw a line, yeah, because I was going to ask about this.
I mean, a new border.
Yeah, so tell me, what do you think that line would be?
Oh, I mean, I'm sure they want to keep all the existing settlements virtually. They might evacuate a few just to make things clearer, but Hebron for sure. And I think they're going to have to remove a large number of Palestinians from around the Hebron area. I think they're going to want to keep everything within the separation barrier. I think they're going to want to keep a large chunk of territory in the center of the West Bank. And I also think they're going to be very tempted to keep the Jordan Valley. And so what you'll end up with is Palestinian areas heavily populated, so most or even all of what is now called Area A, and a lot of what is called Area B, with the exception of Hebron and a few other places, those will be like a kind of, I don't know what they'll call it. It'll be a Palestinian area where Israel doesn't rule. I don't know how this is possibly going to work. Maybe they'll have to leave out the Jordan Valley. The whole thing, I don't know. I don't, there are all kinds of ways of doing it, because if you have all the guns and the other side has no guns, and we live in a world where states can do whatever they want, especially Israel, right? Because Israel can annex occupied territories acquired through war, right? Like the Golan Heights. They annexed the Golan Heights. Trump recognized their annexation of the Golan Heights in total contravention of the UN Charter. Israelis will say, well, it was a defensive war in 1967. Well, actually, they started it. Now, you can claim they were right to start it. You can claim that it was a just war. You can make any claim you like. But the fact is, they struck the first blow. And the other fact is, it's irrelevant. It doesn't matter. The UN Charter doesn't say acquired in an aggressive war. It says acquired through war. Like, you can't expand your territory to pretend or to buy war. And anyone, almost everyone who's ever fought, says to themselves and the public, this is a defensive war. We're defending ourselves. I mean, Hitler, cooked up a fake Polish attack on the eve of his invasion of Poland, and certainly thought he was redressing German grievances, and told himself all those lies. Putin right now is claiming large chunks of Ukraine, including a lot of the southeast of the country and Crimea and what have you, and calls it defensive. He thinks that the West surrounding Russia, that the expansion of NATO is an attack against the Russians, and he won't stand for it. And Ukraine is a fake invention made up by the villains Lenin and Khrushchev, and then picked up by the United States, the other villains. And it's just all a lie. And Ukrainian identity doesn't exist. They're all Russians, and the ones who don't want to be Russians who don't really deserve to live. What? This kind of thing. So you tell yourself it's defensive, right? But it doesn't matter. The UN Charter says acquired through war, period. Any kind of war. So, we put ourselves in a difficult situation for the Israelis. So the message to Israel, loud and clear, from the US and from the world, is you can do whatever you want. You really can. You'll get away with it. You may sit in the penalty box for a while. This may prove some difficulties to you, but ultimately you can do it. It will succeed, and the world will move on.
Well, I don't know. Netanyahu can't really. He'd probably be nervous to fly to.
Yeah, he shouldn't go to Spain or something like that. Yeah, with the ICC indictment against him makes it hard for him to travel to certain places. But those are places he doesn't need to go, and he go.
more broadly on the subject of Israel and Palestine, what are the aspects of it that internally that you are debate? Like for me,
Mm.
I think the two-state solution. I think that's the proper route. I
Of
think
course.
that's the only realistic route.
The only way to end the conflict is some version of that. Yeah,
But
because peoples and both need self-determination.
but sometimes I'll internally debate the spatial.
Yeah, yeah,
There's
yeah,
this argument that the geography that
yeah,
it
yeah.
be. What aspects of Israel Palestine do you internally debate the most? Are you most sort of unsure about?
Oh, I mean, I think that there are a lot of conflicts in history that are never resolved, that just go on until the context in which they define themselves changes so much that they simply disappear. So, for example, in this case, I think it's entirely possible that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict will continue in some form or another until the basic Westphalian nation-state system leaves Southwest Asia and people start organizing themselves in regional coalitions and regional consortiums or something like that. In my view, as long as we have states, especially ethnic states, ethno-religious states, states based on the European model, the Westphalian model, in the Middle East and in the world, then it is my great fear is that this is a conflict that simply will not be resolved. I won't say cannot, because it could have been and still can be resolved, and it might be resolved. If people have any sense whatsoever, they will resolve it, because what they're sentencing themselves to is endless suffering. And Jewish Israelis might, open quote, win, close quote, by successfully annexing most or all of the occupied Palestinian territories and gaining, um, self-declared and largely effectively recognized control over the entirety of British Mandatory Palestine plus the Golan Heights. So even beyond that, that could happen. But the price is going to be endless warfare and more October 7th. I mean, look, those of us who are predicting a massive explosion of savage violence coming out of the occupied Palestinian territories aimed at Israel and Israelis for the past 15, 20 years, we were not kidding. We were not making it up. We were not guessing. We did not think it was likely or probable. We said it was inevitable, unless there was a horizon, some kind of political pathway to freedom. That was going to happen. Palestinians were going to erupt. I couldn't have told you it was going to be last October. I couldn't have told you it would have been definitely out of Gaza or the West Bank or Jerusalem. I didn't know. Would it be Hamas? I don't know. None of that was clear, right? I claim no foresight. It's just that anyone with any horse sense, mukh in Arabic is the word, mukh, which means like horse sense, common sense, basic, minimal intelligence, can see that human beings won't live like that indefinitely without, from time to time, erupting, bursting out of their cages and lashing out with utter savagery. That has been the history of colonial subjects from 1857 at least until the Algerian War ended in 1960-61. And now we have the same kind of thing between the Israelis and the Palestinians.
I want to stay on this geographic thing
Mm-hmm.
because I think it's something
Sure.
Americans often miss, is sort of the spatial realities.
Yeah.
So
Not a lot of land.
yeah, so and apparently the West Bank, they have sort of the higher ground, the hills sort
Yes.
of area.
Yes. Ariel Sharon told the settlers, go grab the hilltops. Which
So,
is
but
every military strategist knows that. I mean, why is the first European permanent settlement in North America in Quebec City? Freezing cold,
yeah.
3 hours, 2 hours north of Montreal driving, super cold. Why? Because it's a very high ground, very easy to defend, very difficult to take, that commands two rivers and the sea.
So
And the Atlantic Ocean. So,
so
I mean, it's just a perfect natural fortress.
how do you respond if Israel were to say, after October 7th, The
Yep.
idea of there's a Palestinian state in the West Bank, and I don't know, they elect Hamas,
Yep.
and they have
Well,
somehow
they're
they
not likely to elect Hamas because the Palestinian state project is a Fatah project.
well,
Hamas has an Islamic State project, which is very different.
uh,
So if a Palestinian state were
right.
secured, it would be a huge political win for Fatah, not
Yeah,
for Hamas.
but I what I'm saying, if they said, well, even if it's not the official government, even if there's a small group of terrorists with super dangerous
Yeah,
weapons,
there'll be some, yeah.
that it's too dangerous because they would be able to shoot rockets down on the main population.
Well, if they did that, it would be, first of all, necessary for the Palestinian government and Palestinian National Guard. I don't think they want a military. They say they don't want a military, and that's smart. But they'll certainly have a National Guard and whatever. It's incumbent on them to suppress that. And trust me, I think the majority of Palestinians would not want that tiny taste of freedom taken away from them because somebody else thinks it's politically advantageous to go further and to attack Israelis and to create a chaos. I don't think that'll be welcomed at all, and I think stopping it will be a relatively popular thing, frankly, because that's what Palestinians want and need is a little bit of freedom, and they'll cherish it if they get it. Of course, there will be crazies, but Then the second thing is that no one is saying that if Israel is under persistent attack and the Palestinian government is unable or unwilling to stop that the Israelis don't have a right to defend themselves. They would have the right. I mean, they've just, in other words, gone on a rampage in Lebanon, absolute rampage, because Hezbollah, for its own political reasons, would not stop firing a limited number of projectiles into Israel that did not that much damage on balance compared to what happened in Lebanon anyway, and compared to what they could have done right before the pagers, their calamity that they brought on themselves. They wouldn't stop for political reasons, right? They felt it necessary to say, oh no, as long as the war in Gaza is going on, we're going to keep trying to have a limited conflict with Israel. Well, the Israelis said no. They called their bluff on that and said, there's no limited conflict. Here you go. Here's your limited conflict. How you like it? We're going to wipe out all your leaders, your commanders. We're going to blow up everything in sight. We're going to kill a whole bunch of people, and we're not going to care. So, that is all, that is not the way to do it. But no one would say the Israelis are bound to tolerate this if it happens. And my point is this. The main response to an Israeli who said that would be, all right, what's your suggestion? If your suggestion is more occupation, that is what produced October 7th. That's it made it inevitable. So if you keep up the occupation, you'll get more of that. I guarantee you. I absolutely guarantee you, you will get more of it. Now, if you end the occupation, there will be a non-linear transition to a stable relationship. Okay, there'll be ups and downs. Okay, and there will be things that Israelis do and things that Palestinians do that the other side won't like. But the agreement will probably stick because it will be in both of their interests. I mean, let me point out something. The Israeli agreement with the peace treaties with Israel, with Egypt, and with Jordan have stuck. And especially, let me look at the Egyptian one. It has stuck through a huge number of very difficult situations, including the first and the second Intifada, through the government of Mubarak, then of the military, then of Muhammad Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood, which did nothing to move away from that tree or undermine it, and now to General Sisi. Why? Because it's in the Egyptian interest. They signed it because it's in their interest. And it doesn't matter who is in power in Egypt. If they are interested in ruling Egypt in an effective way in order to preserve their power, they will keep that treaty going. And the same thing applies to Jordan. And the same thing applies to the Israelis, by the way. They're breaking right now by controlling the Rafah area, the Philadelphia corridor in Gaza. they are breaking the treaty with Egypt and breaking a lot of agreements with Egypt. But the Egyptians are not going to, cut up the treaty based on that. They put up with a lot from the Israelis, and they're sticking with it because it's in their interests. And my point is this: Palestinians will only sign if it's in their interest to do it. And once they decide it's in their interest to do it, then they will have every incentive of maintaining it as best as possible. In other words, this scenario makes no sense, that the Palestinians would sign an agreement that they have no intention of enforcing or trying to enforce.
I think I wonder if you agree with me. I think the biggest obstacle to getting back to this road to a two-state solution is for right or wrong, is Iran.
I totally disagree with you. I think Iran is almost not a factor at all.
Well,
go ahead and tell me why.
Because the Israelis would say, because Iran, they talk about wiping out Israel. They hate the Zionist entity.
And they talk about,
and Israelis say, "Oh, great! If we did this Palestinian state thing, we would have Hezbollah." We could have an Iranian-backed terror group even closer to.
So that would be Hamas, right?
Yeah.
Hamas is the Iranian-backed terrorist organization on Israel's border. Hamas is the product of the occupation, again, for sure. But the bigger point is that Hamas is in a marriage of convenience with Iran. Hamas is nothing like Hezbollah. Hezbollah is the creation of Iran. Hezbollah is Iran's cat paw. Hezbollah doesn't do anything that Iran says definitely don't do it. And if Iran says definitely do something, Hezbollah will do it. The entire history of Hezbollah has not featured a single major disagreement, public disagreement with Iran on one single issue ever. Never. A friend of mine and I, both Lebanese, both, scholars of this kind of stuff, sat down and we tried to think of something. For like a couple of hours we were discussing it, and we couldn't come up with one. Not one. They are on the payroll. They are made men. Okay, and they don't disagree. Hamas was not founded. Iran had nothing to do with the founding of Hamas, right? And Hamas is a Sunni Muslim Brotherhood organization with ideologies fundamentally at odds with Iran's Khomeiniite Shiite revolutionary model. They were in a marriage of convenience based on the idea that they have common enemies. The usual reason that anybody makes an unsteady alliance. But come the Syrian war, the Muslim Brotherhood was a key part of the political movement that led the uprising against Assad in 2011, 2012. And at that point, the Iranians and especially the regime of al-Assad said to the Hamas leaders who were headquartered, they'd done a deal where they were allowed to leave Gaza to get them out of there. And the Politburo of Hamas, which was then really ruling the organization, eventually ended up in Damascus, right? And they were told, pick, your brothers are trying to kill us, right? And you are our guests here. So which side are you on? This is not an essay question, and this is not something that can be postponed. You give us a simple answer. Are you with us? Yes or no? And they basically had to choose between a very useful marriage of convenience with Iran and its network or their identity. Well, of course they chose their identity. Naturally, they could not do otherwise, right? They chose their identity and they fled to Qatar, where they have lived until now. The Qataris have shown them the door, and they fled to Turkey, where I don't know that they'll be able to stay all that long, but we'll see, maybe. My point is this, that during the Syrian war, it didn't take much to break that alliance, right? It didn't, I mean, there was no way for Hamas to stay in the open quote axis of resistance, close quote, while remaining Muslim brothers, right? And it took the end of the Syrian war to allow them to get back into the Iranian network. But the reason that Hezbollah did not go to all-out war with Israel on October 7th, as Hamas was demanding, and restricted themselves to a moderate uptick in cross-border rocket attacks of a quite limited basis for a long time, and were very restrained for most of this war, which, although they did not stop firing, so they gave Israel every reason to keep escalating, but it wasn't them who was escalating, it was them who started it. The point is that they did not, neither Hezbollah nor Iran were willing to go to war for an ally they considered fundamentally unreliable, which is Hamas, and a place, Gaza, that has no cultural, religious, or strategic significance to them. So they really kind of didn't care. And one of the reasons the Israelis took the war to Hezbollah so heavily is they wanted Iran and its alliance to pay a price, because they knew that they didn't give a damn about what was happening in Gaza, either to Hamas or to the Palestinian people, that they really didn't care. That was not a concern. They were not willing to go to war for them. So Israel was paying a cost, right, in lives and reputation and money and all that stuff. And the Palestinians were paying a heavy cost, and Hamas was paying a cost, but Iran was benefiting, especially as Israel was kind of weakened and Israel was under pressure, without paying any cost. And they were like, no, we're going to inflict a major strategic blow. We're going to either get you to back down, or we're going to crush you. And they ended up crushing Hezbollah. So you get my point here. Hamas is not joined at the hip to Iran at all.
My point is just from, I think, politically in Israel, having the specter.
You mean the perception?
Yeah, having the specter of.
Okay, so yes,
Iran.
Sure.
It gets their backs, and I think it's understandable that that's going to be this excuse for why we can't do.
Yeah. So here's the thing. So I agree with you. You're absolutely right. Iran is, so now I think I've understood your argument better, and I think you do actually have a point. When at first I said you didn't have a point, but I think you do, which is that Iran serves as a convenient rationalization for those who don't want to make any kind of reasonable deal with Palestinians at all, to explain why they don't want to make any reasonable deal at all. And I think that's true. I think Iran is a good reason. I think October 7th is a good reason, whether you say it was the work of Iran directly or indirectly. Indirectly, it was, in the sense that they'd done a lot of training and arming of Hamas and encouragement of Hamas. And I think they had been told there was something brewing. I don't think they took it seriously. I think they were surprised on October 7th. There's every evidence of that. They were not really anticipating that it would be anything like that, and it put them in a bind. But my point would be this: you can always find an excuse.
I agree. I agree with it. Yeah.
I mean, there's never a lack of an excuse for not doing so. And look, fundamentally, it's more than that. Like, making a deal with Palestinians requires Israelis to do something that is very, very, very hard, which is to give up on something you really, really want, right? Even though you can take it. And people can have enlightened self-interest as individuals or in very small groups, like maybe a nuclear family. That's possible to have enlightened self-interest. When you talk about tribal, coalitions, states, constituencies of a country, and it's very, very difficult to act with enlightened self-interest. Extremely difficult, and it's more likely that the majority of a country will act like a toddler. And I don't know if you had any kids, but I've had two, and they were recently toddlers, and they're still very young. And I can tell you that when a toddler really, 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 really wants something, and deeply wants it, and there's nothing that will stop them from getting it, you know what they do? They take it. And that's the situation we have with Israel and the land in the occupied territories. And earlier Zionism did not stress much about the particularities of what part of Eretz Israel became the Jewish state. Would it be all of it would be ideal, but if you had to leave parts, well, you certainly would need Tel Aviv, and you want, West Jerusalem, but you don't stress that much about East Jerusalem, which, the Jordanians held in 1948, and which the Israelis had to take in 1967, much later. And, well, they were very glad to get it. The state of Israel existed and went along merrily, actually, without East Jerusalem and without Hebron and without Jericho. Well, I said with Jericho, but without Bethlehem and places like that. Now there is a much stronger attachment to revisionist Zionism of the kind espoused by Jabotinsky and especially Shamir. Yitzhak Shamir, the former prime minister, was, I think, still the most right-wing prime minister in Israeli history. He was not a religious man at all, but he considered the Bible like a kind of historic deed, and he was a very passionate, was almost a fascist in a way, and certainly an irredentist of enormous capacity, right? A huge irredentist, and he wanted all the land. And, you've had also since then the rise of religious Zionism, of a kind that used to be kind of rare and is now very common, where the ultra-Orthodox are all in on annexation and what have you. So you've got a population now which is really dead set on annexation in a majoritarian way, which was not true in the past, even though the Israeli state has been building towards annexation since 1967. I think in many cases it was done not unintentionally, but at a liminal level of consciousness by the policymakers. But increasingly, it's become an open goal. And the current cabinet coalition has, the Israeli cabinets tend to have coalition agreements written. And the current one says that the Jewish people alone will have sovereignty and self-determination between the river and the sea. In other words, no Palestinian state whatsoever. And whatever the arrangement is, it's not going to include Palestinian citizenship in Israel or in an independent state. So these people are still adrift.
So I was listening to an interesting audio of Christopher Hitchens and Edward.
Oh, my brother. Hitchens was one of my closest friends. We were like brothers.
I actually interviewed him once.
Yeah.
He was very nice to me. Yeah.
He was beautiful human being.
Yeah, and God, I'm so curious what he would be saying right now.
Well, I can tell you he would be one of the leaders of the anti-fascist movement in the United States, without a doubt.
Yeah. So, but it was him and Edward Said in 2000.
Yeah.
And they were talking.
Mm-hmm.
And Edward Said was talking about working with this Palestinian-Israeli orchestra in Germany.
Yes, with Barenbaum.
But what was so interesting was you got a sense of the aura of the times, and these words were coming: peace, cooperation.
Yeah, different.
These concepts have totally fallen by the wayside.
Yep. The Second Intifada was the great inflection point. Two things happened, if I may.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. In the summer of 2000, Bill Clinton very stupidly insisted on convening the Camp David summit. Yasser Arafat didn't want to go. Clinton insisted. Arafat went on condition he would not be blamed if there was any failure, because he expected a failure. And Clinton said, "You will not be blamed, I promise you." And then when it failed, he was promptly blamed. What they discovered then was that Israelis and Palestinians had been talking past each other for 7 years, since the Oslo Accords were made, and even before that, since the Oslo negotiations began around 1991, secretly. That they had been using different signifiers, or the same signifiers, like sovereignty or statehood for Palestinians or something like that, with completely different signifieds. In other words, they were imagining very different things. When they would say Palestinian state, Israelis were thinking about one thing, like a little archipelago of like Bantustans. And Palestinians were thinking about a Westphalian style state in the occupied territories with its capital in East Jerusalem and a connectivity road and railway from Gaza to the West Bank. That's what they were thinking of. Israelis were thinking of something completely different. And so they discovered that. And the whole thing was a kind of dumb, dumber, and dumbest festival. So dumb was the Israelis, who came with a completely unworkable plan for the Palestinians thought was outrageous. The Israelis tried to sell it as incredibly generous, but it wasn't. It was a non-starter, and I think any sensible person would know that. The Palestinians dumber. They came with no counteroffer. They had nothing. They came up with counteroffers later. A couple months, like a month and a half later, they came up with a solid counteroffer. But I'd say, you show up at this meeting without a counteroffer, you're nuts. I mean, that is so dumb, right? Dumbest was Clinton, because he had a very good bridging proposal called the Clinton Parameters that were actually very sound. And to this day, they're very sound as principles for dividing the West Bank between the big bulk that would become a Palestinian state and those chunks that would become Israeli, and dealing with Jerusalem and things like that. The main principle being whatever is Israeli stays Israeli in like Jerusalem and greater Jerusalem area, and what's Palestinian stays Palestinian, things like that. So my point is, but he didn't pull it out. He didn't pull it out until weeks after the failure of the summit, but he had it ready. Instead, he kept pressing the Palestinians to take this non-starter Israeli deal. So dumb, dumber, and dumbest. Then the second Intifada erupts in September, right? When Sharon goes to the Temple Mount, Haram Sharif, and there's a riot. And then the key inflection point, the Mitchell report makes it very clear that it wasn't Sharon's visit, nor was it a planned Palestinian action. It was a series of events that began with a very deadly, very violent Israeli border guard attack on the Palestinian protesters at the wall. And that produced a bunch of deaths, and that kicked off the Second Intifada. The First Intifada was largely nonviolent or symbolically violent, like kids throwing rocks at heavily armored soldiers. And as the soldiers then were under orders from Defense Minister Rabin to break their legs and arms in response. It was very brutal, but not a lot of killing on either side, especially in the first year of it. The Second Intifada was extremely violent on the Israeli side right away. And in the first few months, hundreds of Palestinians died. Then Palestinians led by Hamas started suicide bombing in January and especially in February of 2001, which appalled me. And I took a very strong stance against it. I called it wicked, stupid, and cruel. It got in a lot of arguments of people who were saying, don't, go after the Palestinians, stick to the Israelis. And I'm like, what? Do you agree with suicide bombing? They're like, no, but focus on the Israelis. And I'm like, hey, I'm talking to Americans here. I can't, they're not going to listen to me if I don't, if I let someone else bring up the issue, I'm done for. I have to proactively say what I think, which is that this is dumb, cruel, wicked, stupid, awful, indefensible. Which, it's easy to say what you believe. It's a problem with that. So anyway, come 9/11, I think a lot of people were grateful I had done that. But anyway, my point is that the Second Intifada was violent right away, right? And about 3.5 to 4,000 Palestinians ended up getting killed. About 1,100 to 1,200 Israelis were killed. And both sides were absolutely radicalized by it. The Israeli peace camp fell apart. The number of people in Israel who wanted a two-state solution collapsed and has never really gained ground. Among Palestinians in the occupied territories, Hamas became a contender for national leadership for the first time. Before the Second Intifada, it was a very marginal group and really secondary to Fatah. After the Second Intifada, during and after, they became a plausible contender for national leadership. So they remain. And outside, the pro-Palestinian people became one-state solution guys.
That
Everyone.
this is what I was going to ask about. There's been a lot of protests in the U.S. since October 7th. Pro-Palestinian protests.
Yep. Thank goodness.
What would you say to Israeli says, well, look at them. They don't even talk about a two-state solution. They don't really want it.
Well, I would say you haven't talked to them, because I have. And there are, here's the thing about a protest movement. If the protesters are not engaged directly, then the loudest, most strident voices get to speak for them. The people who get the headlines are the people who say outrageous things, people who are frankly mentally ill, or people who are professional agitators, many of them not students, people who are Antifa or Code Pink or something very, very far left. People whose profession, whose job literally it is to be agitators. And they come along and they find this wonderful issue on which to glom and which to hijack. And they do it. But I can tell you, I've been to, now 27, 28, something like that, campuses since October of last year to talk about this issue. And I've met with, everywhere I've gone, virtually, I've met with protesters where there are some places were smart enough, some colleges were smart enough to proactively engage their student body right away and give people a voice, so they didn't need to set up an encampment. They didn't feel any, they didn't have any problem getting their voice heard, which is the way to do it, right? I mean, you're a university, let people talk, organize events that say, the more the merrier, come talk, and we just need to keep it civil. Here's what civil looks like. You can begin with some demonstration events, and then open it up to everybody. And there are ways of doing this, with Columbia, you'd think it was the first time there was ever like a massive speech issue at Columbia or at these schools. Anyway, my point is this. Yeah. I've talked to a lot of these guys, and there is a range of opinion. So a lot of them are one-staters, but they don't know that much about the issue. A lot of them are just against the war. Frankly, a lot of them, that's all I heard, from some of them was, we just have to stop the genocide, stop the genocide, stop the genocide. They're very anti-Israel because they blame Israel for a genocide, which appalls them. And honestly, if you're a student activist, social justice activist with an international perspective, and you did not become an outraged activist in the last 12 months, there's something wrong with you. No, seriously, like this, especially when the United States was doing so much to make this possible. So, I mean, I really think those students in the main were absolutely commendable. And I'm with them, and I like them, and I'm glad they did what they did, frankly. And I think that, the extremists who raise their voice and praise terrorism and, sort of called for the killing of Israelis or the end of Zionists, by force or something. These are radicals. These are not representative of the majority of people in these encampments and what have you that I have met, frankly. And I've met people of all different stripes. I mean, two-staters, one-staters, no-staters, no idea people. Many of them don't know what they really think. A lot of them don't know much. They just know that there is a mass killing going on, that nothing can justify it, which is correct, and they want it to stop, damn it. And that's, all of that was right on the money. And they blame the US government for supporting it. All of that is absolutely simply the case.
Why has Hamas, I've been surprised, I mean, they've lost clearly.
No, they have not. They have won. No, they have won. They have won politically. You see, you have to understand that wars are fought both militarily and politically. All right. And you gotta, to understand whether Hamas has won or lost, you have to look at their goals. Okay. And their goal from the beginning, and I wrote this on October 13th of last year, right? So this is not a view I came to late. I saw this immediately. Their goal was to provoke a long-term war with Israel. And they said so, right? And what would a long-term war with Israel mean? for Hamas. It would have to be an insurgency in Gaza. That's the only thing it could be, because that's the only place they were. So what they wanted to do was to lure Israel in and get the Israelis to stay and have them be the targets of an insurgency, not in the next year or two, but the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. Honestly, they're playing a long game here. And their target isn't Israel. Their target is Fatah. They were founded in 1987. There was a vacuum of leadership when the first Intifada broke out. It was being run by local committees, ad hoc teachers and lawyers and notable landowners and all kind of doctors, all kind of folk who just got together and kind of ran things in a Gramscian way, right? And the PLO was in Tunisia, and it took them over a year to get control over the Intifada and to get back into the West Bank. And the whole effort was being led by Abu Jihad, who was shot by Israeli assassins in front of his family at his house in Tunisia. And in that vacuum of leadership, right, with no organized leadership on the ground in the West Bank or Gaza, with all this political unrest, and with the PLO in Tunisia and struggling to exert their authority, even though they were the national leadership, they didn't have a big presence. The Muslim Brotherhood in Gaza formed Hamas as a political party and a paramilitary organization with primary goal, prime directive is take over the Palestinian national movement and make it an Islamist movement, not a nationalist, secular nationalist movement, which is what Fatah is. Make it an Islamist movement taken over by Hamas and become the national leadership. That's the prime directive. Why? Well, because why do people form political parties? In every case, no matter what the agenda or the ideology is, it's always the same reason. It's to gain power. And the reason for that is you can't do anything unless you have power. And you must secure power domestically, internally, before you can really target in a significant way an external foe, right? External foes are your means to gaining internal power. So this is true, for example, of the progressive left in the Democratic Party, which wants to take over the Democrats. It was true of the MAGA movement, which wanted to take over the Republican Party and did. So you first have to take over your inside, and then you get to the next target. So Israel will be a target of Hamas, and it's the subtext of the whole thing. But the main target now of this war is Fatah.
Yeah, a trivia question: who is the leader of that raid that killed the Palestinian leader in Algeria?
It was Ehud Barak.
No, I think it was Yoav Gallant.
I don't believe so. I believe Ehud Barak. Well, on the ground, maybe it was.
Yeah.
Ehud Barak was in an airplane overhead.
Oh.
So maybe Yoav Gallant was the guy who pulled the trigger on Abu Jihad.
Yeah, he came ashore.
Okay.
With the
Ehud Barak did that in the 70s in Beirut. He came dressed as a woman, and they killed Kamal Adwan, left him in a crucifix position, actually.
Really?
And a bunch of really
in the
nasty.
movie Munich depicted.
Yeah, that was. But, yeah.
I'm wrapping up here. I promise. Interestingly,
don't worry about it.
A past guest, Seth Franzman, who probably
I know him. Yeah. I don't know him personally, but I know his work. He's fine.
It's very interesting, and it would be good to maybe have you two on together. You guys, your answers are like very similar but different.
Yeah, they're good. Yeah.
He also, but it'd be very interesting to hear you talk about the West Bank. I was going to ask, why hasn't Hamas been more eager to make a deal?
Because they like the war. Well, no, they're enjoying the war. I mean, I don't mean that they're like enjoying it in a normal way. I mean like jouissance, like the French term of the Lacan. Something that gives you emotional satisfaction. Like, politically, they're benefiting from it. Not that it makes them more popular. You got to understand. The goal is not to be more popular, because they've lost popularity in the West Bank. People are really mad at them. A lot of people are really mad at them, even though the Israelis have done their best to make Hamas popular. People are really pissed off at Hamas in Gaza. In the West Bank, they're a little bit more impressed because they have been less subjected to the consequences. So, you know, but they're not aiming for popularity now. They're aiming to take over the movement, which is going to take a while because look, the crown jewel of the Palestinian national movement is the international presence and stature role of the Palestine Liberation Organization, right? It is by every single international Arab, Palestinian, Israeli, any document whatsoever you can find, the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people politically and diplomatically. That means everywhere that a Palestinian gets up to speak for the nation, whether it's at the UN General Assembly, where the state of the PLO is present as the state of Palestine, a non-member observer state. And I'll explain the benefit of that in a minute. Whether it's in the General Assembly of the UN, any of these international multilateral organizations like UNICEF and UNESCO and World Food Organization, World Health Organization, the ICC and the ICJ, I'll come back to them in a minute. The Arab League, 130 embassies around the world. Every time a Palestinian gets up to speak for the country, guess who it is? It's a Fatah guy. Hamas is not a member of the PLO. It has never been a member of the PLO. And Fatah has been very clear since 1993. If you want to join, you have to recognize the legitimacy and primacy of all of our diplomatic undertakings. The treaties with Israel, for example, the Oslo Agreement, the recognition of the state of Israel. All Israeli-Palestinian negotiations are predicated on an exchange of letters in 1993. Right? Arafat, the weaker party, always has to ask first, always has to do more, the burden is always on the weaker, naturally. So Arafat wrote to Rabin in his capacity as chairman of the Palestine Liberation Organization, to Rabin in his capacity as Prime Minister of Israel, recognizing Israel, its right to exist free of threats of terrorism and what have you. Okay, then Rabin replied, in his capacity as Prime Minister of Israel, to Arafat in his capacity of PLO chairman, saying that Israel recognizes the PLO as a legitimate interlocutor and undertakes to enter into negotiations with it. Now, you'll notice an asymmetry of recognitions here. One is a recognition of the state, the other is a recognition of an organization to talk to, but no recognition of not just the Palestinian state, but the Palestinian right to a state, which Israel has never recognized. They have never recognized the Palestinian right to a state. Now, what I want to emphasize is the example of the ICC and the ICJ. Right now, as you said, Netanyahu has to be very careful where he goes. Yoav Gallant too, because there is an international arrest warrant for them based on using starvation as a weapon of war in Gaza, a crime which I believe they're manifestly guilty. And they could be arrested by any signatory to the statute that governs the work of the ICC. The ICC. Now, the reason that the ICC and the ICJ have jurisdiction over Netanyahu and Gallant, or over Israel at the ICJ, where South Africa is pursuing a genocide charge against Israel that didn't look all that strong when they first brought it, but now with the ethnic cleansing in northern Gaza is looking pretty solid in my view. I mean, the Israelis are really working hard to get themselves convicted in the ICJ, frankly, of genocide. And my point is this: how do the ICC and the ICJ have standing at jurisdiction over a territory where, over people, the Israelis, whose government has never signed the treaties governing the work of the ICC and the ICJ, right? And the answer is that in their capacity as the state of Palestine, the PLO, therefore the state of Palestine, did accede to the treaties, and Gaza is presumed by all parties to be except for Israel, but Israel is not part of this process because it wouldn't sign the document. It is presumed by everyone to be a part of the putative state of Palestine that has acceded to those treaties, giving the ICC and the ICJ jurisdiction over anything that relevant to their work that happens inside or coming out of Gaza. That's it. That shows the power of the non-member observer state status that the state of Palestine gained. It's not just a sign, right? It has led directly to Netanyahu having an international arrest warrant against him. So I'm telling you that the PLO, if you don't run the PLO, you're not the Palestinian national leadership. No matter what you say, you're not. And Hamas has to gain control of the PLO or replace the PLO. And the difficulty for them is not merely the political struggle with Fatah. The difficulty is, how do you do that while not disturbing the status of the PLO at the UN and elsewhere, right? How do you do that? And that's tricky when you become radioactive. But like I said, they're playing a 20-year game here. They have a very long-term vision, in my view. I do think there's a difference between the people who authored this idea inside Gaza and some of the Politburo outside who are kind of horrified at the idea that they would throw away everything that was built since 2007 when they seized control of Gaza violently from Fatah. But it was a calculated gamble by Yahya Sinwar and the others. Now his brother is in charge in Gaza, Mohammed Sinwar, that it was worth throwing the whole barrel, throwing over the whole barrow. I mean, the whole hot dog stand, just smash it up. And in order to get that war, which they think eventually will give them authority.
It's like a Hail Mary pass sort of thing.
Yep, big time. Except that they have confidence. They don't see it that way. I see it that way. But and it literally Hail Mary, because a lot of it's based on, God will help us. I mean, there's both on the Israeli side and on the Palestinian side, this has never been a religious war. But it's looking like becoming more and more and more like a religious war, as you have religious fanatics, trying to become the leadership of the Palestinian national movement and going to war for that, and religious fanatics increasingly dominating the Israeli government. Netanyahu is not one of them, but he has several in his cabinet.
What I was going to say is, I agree with you that, I think Israel should have ended this. It should never fight long wars. It should have just ended this thing in Gaza a while ago. But I was listening to you on the great France 24.
Oh,
which
yeah.
I love.
I love France 24.
And it's such an embarrassment that show is better than anything on PBS.
Today? Yeah. Well, I like the NewsHour. I mean,
I take that back. I like PBS. But
the NewsHour, and also like Washington Week, Goldberg's. I like Goldberg.
Yeah. No, I like PBS, but I love France 24. Beautiful set.
It's a lot better.
It looks great. I was listening to you on a recent.
They have deeper. You know what the thing is? They have deeper ties to the region, and a bigger Rolodex.
Francois Picard is a great.
Oh,
host.
he's great. He's great. Yeah.
And
who's also great is the guy in Ontario, the guy who hosts the agenda.
Steve Paitkin. He's very good too. Yeah,
he's great. That's another great show.
But I heard you on it, and I heard you say that the only reason Israel is still in Gaza is vengeance.
Yeah, I don't think that. Okay. I said the reason that they're fighting the war continues to be primarily vengeance, and I think that's true. I think whether staying there or not is a different question. But the reason the war keeps going from an Israeli point of view is they're not done seeking vengeance. Yes, I think that's true.
But they would say, you're forgetting, Hussein, you say we're there for vengeance and the killing and all this stuff.
That's what they say.
But you're forgetting, you're not mentioning one word. Hostages.
Well, yeah, of course. But here's the thing. I mean, they have time and again chosen the war, continuing to choose the war over negotiating for hostages. For example, the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran was a brilliant coup from the point of view of intelligence and assassination. And it was a very well-conducted murder. But it was not anything anyone would do if your main goal is trying to release
But
hostages, because he was the main negotiator.
but they
You
were
know, so
rejecting. They've rejected a lot of.
oh yeah, Hamas doesn't want a
Yeah.
deal. I've been clear about that from the
Okay.
beginning,
Yeah.
right? Hamas does not want a deal. They don't. But the hostage issue has been, seriously abused and hijacked by Netanyahu. He doesn't want a deal either, and he's made no effort to get one, and he's blocked every move to get one. And even his one of his aides is arrested for illegally leaking information designed to sabotage hostage negotiations. I mean, out of his own office. So, there's no look. If you're looking at these two ruling powers, in Hamas, or these two warring parties, Hamas and the government of Israel, you will not find anyone in their leadership who really wants everybody would like their prisoners and hostages back and everything, but no one's prioritizing it.
I think.
Absolutely not.
Yeah. I think Gallant maybe
I
was
don't
more.
believe that. No,
Yeah.
I don't think so. I
Well,
don't believe a word that comes out of his mouth.
so and I
I judge
really.
all these people based on their deeds and not their words. These are liars. On both sides, they're all liars. You wouldn't believe anyone from Hamas, you're nuts. If you believe anyone in this Israeli government, you're nuts. They're all completely congenital liars. You're
Um,
welcome, but you're not going to get a good word out of me on either Hamas or the Israeli government. I think they're both soaked in blood, and both, should be in the dock at the ICC and looking at the rest of their lives in prison.
well, so that's what I sort of want to end on, which is like what you would have done after October 7th. But can I begin with?
If I'd been an Israeli leader,
Well, yeah, but
okay, two things.
first, I want to give you my proposal. What I would have
Sure,
done.
you go for it. Yeah.
So, I think after October 7th, they should have just had a press conference and said, "Look, we're taking over control of the Rafah crossing for a period of time. We can't have any more guns, ammo, digging equipment enter Gaza, and then and then just not touched the rest of Gaza, and basically said to Hamas, hey, fire your rockets, please. Those are your last rockets. And we don't give a damn if you want to handle garbage collection.
Yeah. Well, they don't. They don't actually want to do that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's what
all right.
I would have done. What would you have done?
Okay. I think the main thing I would have done differently is look at this from a political rather than a military perspective. In other words, I would have asked myself, what does Hamas want? Right. And our goal in determining what they want is so that we can deny them what they want. Right. And what they want, first of all, is for us to go heavily into Gaza. So that's not what we're going to do. They want us to stay in Gaza for a long time. That's not what we're going to do. And they want us to help them take over the Palestinian national leadership from Fatah. So that's not what we're going to do. Here's what we're going to do. First, we are going to kill everyone who was in the inner circle of planning this. So we have a long-term assassination policy like the Black September or the Black September assassinations, in 1973. Okay, that's first thing. Second thing, we're going to, make a set of targets in Gaza that are political and military, and we're going to take them out in a way that is, designed to, have the least possible civilian deaths. But if there are some, we will explain why we're doing this, and that it's going to be in a limited manner. Right. The main thing, and that would have been my military response. Fine. And I think seizing control of the Philadelphia corridor is unnecessary. You might want to beef up cooperation with the Egyptians. But I'm not sure. I mean, I'd be 50-50 on that. I'd be willing to sit and talk and look at the raw intelligence and really, is it, how much benefit is this going to get us? What's the cost of it? Is it going to give Hamas a permanent target to attack? Are we going to fall into their trap in a small way by being there? I would have probably, been all in on creating a much bigger and stronger buffer zone between Israel and Gaza. But the main thing I would have done is change my policy towards the Palestinians. And I would have said to myself, look, we've had a policy of divide and rule. We have done our best to keep Hamas in power in Gaza, but surrounded and besieged and literally cut down to size by these grass mowing wars that we do. And we've tried to keep Fatah in power in the West Bank, but looking absolutely ridiculous and making no progress whatsoever on towards two states. So here's what we got to do. We got to weaken Hamas politically, right? And the main way we do that is by strengthening Fatah politically. In other words, we take Palestinian politics seriously and we play the Palestinian political game because that's the game that Hamas is playing, and we're going to gang up with their enemies against them. Now, the Israelis haven't done that because they blame all Palestinians for October 7. They have taken a very dim view of Fatah. They have tried their best to provoke it, to strangle it, to cut it off. They have withheld its main income, which is the tax revenues, import-export mainly taxes, that Israel, because the Palestinians don't have any sovereignty and don't control their borders, Israel has to, or it doesn't have to, but it does, collect these income, this tax revenue, and they have refused to give it to the Palestinian Authority. They have also moved, they haven't done this yet, but they've been preparing to cut the PA off from using Israeli banks. And so basically by financially strangling the PA, they would take away the last value it has for Palestinians, which is, employment and providing services like health and education. You can't do any of that. You can't meet payroll, and you can't have schools and hospitals if you don't have any money. And by cutting them off they're strangling them politically, they are crucifying them, by strangling them economically, they're crucifying them politically. Maybe that's not a good word to use. They are suffocating them politically. Let's say that. Okay, I understand. Suddenly I remember there's some bad connotations of that. So we won't talk about ancient Roman torture. Let's just say the point would be to beef up Fatah and give them some victories. So basically, I would recognize that, look, we have two sets of Palestinians here. We have the Palestinians who want to talk to us and make a deal, and the Palestinians who want to kill us and not make a deal. So let's talk to the Palestinians who want to talk to us. Let's work with them. Let's give them some strength here. Let's give them some victories. Let's give them some stuff. I mean, why would you not? But if you're all in on annexation and you view all Palestinians as bad and all of them as the enemy, and this is the attitude of not just the extremists, but Netanyahu is an extremist in this regard. Benny Gantz is an extremist in this regard. To get to anyone who takes a two-state agreement seriously, you have to get to Meretz in the Israeli left.
But do you think Gantz, you think Gantz, who was in the cabinet, is no longer? Do you think he really wanted Gazan land?
No, he doesn't. He wanted to end the Gaza war and get out of Gaza. And he doesn't, he's not all in on annexation, but he absolutely rules out a Palestinian state of any kind at any time.
Well,
under those circumstances, he is really an extremist.
Yeah.
I mean, to be that is to be anti-peace.
I totally agree with you. And so often I would point out what Israelis would say, oh, look at how high the support is for Hamas in the West Bank. And I would say, well, why do you think that is? It's because the settlement expansion makes Abbas look like a clown.
Also, the Gaza war, war looks patriotic from a distance.
Right.
Now, when you're in Gaza, it can look like, why have you signed up my family for like martyrdom without ever asking anybody? Those kind of questions get much more pointed because Fatah has been since May or June. Fatah has been blunt. They're sensing the weakening of Hamas politically. They have started saying, you are responsible for a Nakba, a catastrophe worse than 1947-48, and you are responsible for signing up 2.2 million people, including lots of children, for martyrdom without consulting anybody, without consulting us, without consulting the people of Gaza, without consulting anyone. You just decided unilaterally to bring this catastrophe upon Gaza, and what the hell is wrong with you? And it's a very strong response they've had. And it's not falling on deaf ears in Gaza anyway. It's the spirit of Hitchens.
The Gigi Hadid question, as I call it.
What is that?
The right of return. So
Oh yeah,
Palestinian. So
yeah.
Gigi Hadid was born in 1995 to a Palestinian father, Danish mother.
Is she some sort of model or something, right?
Yeah.
Okay,
She was born in Beverly Hills.
I can't picture her, but I've heard the name.
She born in Beverly Hills, half Palestinian.
Well, that's nice for her.
So, do you think she has a right to Israeli citizenship that has to be insisted upon?
You know, her parents are what are her parentage again now?
Her father is a Palestinian American.
No, I don't. And her mother is what?
Danish.
Yeah, I don't think so.
Okay.
I mean, I think someone like that, I'm sure she's not registered as a refugee with the UNRWA.
I think she is.
She is? Well, how do you know that? I mean,
I could be wrong, but I thought
I
it was
would be very
reported.
surprised. I'd be very
Okay.
surprised. The people UNRWA registers are largely the people they do services for. Nobody in Beverly Hills needs UNRWA. You know, UNRWA is about meeting people's minimal needs, shelter at a basic level, minimal health care, food, nutrition, you know, food packages, and modest schools. And that's what UNRWA does and has done since the 40s, because the international community understood at that time that that the UN had been responsible in large part for the creation of this refugee population through the partition plans and the many other ways in which they sort of encouraged the 47-48 crisis civil war in Palestine, and then the bigger Arab-Israeli war in 48. That, you know, really the UN had played and the League of Nations before that, and the Western powers had played a very big role in setting things up for that to happen. And they understood that they did bear some responsibility. So UNRWA was created, and it continues because it's an open-ended commitment until the refugee issue is resolved by some sort of an agreement. And I do not think Hadid would look. The return was not the big sticking point between Israeli and Palestinian negotiators in the 90s. Okay, not at Camp David, but at Taif in December of 2000 and early in January of 2000, before the negotiations were cut off because of the Israeli election, which was won by Ariel Sharon, and they were never resumed until much, much later. And they never went anywhere after that, by the way, even when they were resumed. But the point is that the Israelis and Palestinians at that time had reached an understanding that the Palestinian right of return would be largely exercised in a Palestinian state, right? And that there would be a number of Palestinians who would return to live in their former homes or lands in Israel, but that it would be done on the basis of a committee that would include Israelis. Basically, Israel would have a veto over the number and the identities of the people who would have that right. And that would be for a limited time, that this committee would annually allot return. And the Israelis were going to call it family reunification, and the Palestinians were going to call it the right of return. And this was where they were in negotiations. Where they could not make headway, or the big sticking point, was Jerusalem. Because the Palestinians wanted to put their capital in East Jerusalem. They didn't necessarily want to rule over all of East Jerusalem. They wanted East Jerusalem to serve as their capital, which are two very different things. And the Israelis would not budge on anything to do with Jerusalem at all. Until later. Then Ehud Olmert was willing to talk seriously.
So do you think there's any deal like Olmert was
yeah, he had a very good deal. Yeah, that was a good deal, and that would have worked. The problem is the Palestinians thought I remember when it happened, I was still on good terms with the PLO at the time. We hadn't fallen out yet. That was a later thing. Mm-hmm. But they were saying at the time, we like what we're hearing, but we don't think it's serious because he doesn't have the support of his own cabinet. His own foreign minister is openly trashing him, Tzipi Livni, about this. And we don't see any public support for him. And we think that if we go ahead and accept or embrace this idea, we will pay the political cost for all the concessions we'll be making, which are considerable, right? I mean, obviously, on return and on land and all these things. It was a good offer, but it was also, based on Israeli dominance, right? It was a very um, it was much better for the Israelis than the Palestinians. But the point is, it's always going to be because they basically have all the power. So Palestinians have to take what they can get, insofar as it's acceptable, right? Obviously, they shouldn't sign a terrible deal. But I think this one was okay from their point of view, at least the PLO. But the problem is they thought if they embraced it, they would pay the political cost for the concessions that were built in, and they'd never get the offer formally. That this was just something on the back of a napkin that he would show them, and he wouldn't give it to them in writing. He wouldn't give them anything in writing. He wouldn't let them make notes. He wouldn't give them a map. He wouldn't know. It was all just word of mouth. And so they concluded that good, but it's just not a real offer. It's not anything we can take to the bank. Now, I interviewed Olmert for an hour under the auspices of Northwestern University earlier this year. It was a very interesting conversation. I'm sure it's online if your viewers want to see it. Olmert's a very interesting guy. I have a lot of respect for him. He's very, very smart. And he's well-meaning. He's one of the very few Israeli prime ministers who are genuinely well-meaning. Rabin wasn't really tested. He probably was well-meaning, but we can't be sure. With Olmert, I think we can be sure. But his response, he said, I made this great offer, and I don't know what the hell, why wouldn't they take it? And I said to him what I just said to you. And he said, yes, but what they should have done is accepted it, right, and called my bluff. If they had accepted it, I could have gone to the Israeli public and said, hey, they've accepted it. We can end the conflict right now. And he said, I think I could have gotten mass support for this, and I think it could have been a thing. But they had to help me by saying even a tentative yes, but by just not saying anything, which is what they said, and saying there's no real offer on the table because they didn't have anything in writing, and they didn't have any map, and they didn't have any notes, and they see that already his own government is lining up to outbid each other in opposing it, let alone the opposition. It was a rational response by the Palestinians from a political leadership point of view. In other words, it was a political decision not to pay the political consequences, but it was cowardly, in my view. A bold leadership, which they don't have and they haven't had for many, many years. I mean, they have had it in the past, but not for a long time. Would have said yes and gone for it, or tentatively yes, or yes if you can make it real, or something like that. At least you say yes, but. In fact, with diplomacy, you should never say no. You should always say yes, but. And then what follows the but is what really matters. I think he's right about that, but, spilled milk.
Before we end, can you tell us so if an event happens in Israel, who are the writers, the analysts, the experts that you look to, that you trust the most?
Yeah, okay, so let's see. If for news, Barak Ravid, who writes for Axios, is the best source because the Israelis leak to him very, often. And it's different Israelis with different purposes. You have to read it wondering, like, who told him this and why. And so you can't read it just like innocently, right? You can't read it naively. But he's a very good source of information. I think there are quite a few Israeli analysts who are really excellent. I was reading several today in Haaretz that I thought were really good. There's a guy called Shaul Areli, who's very, very good. I think old Amira Haas is still worth checking out. I think she's very good. I think what's his name, that writes for Al Monitor. And it's a subscription site, but it's worth subscribing to. Ben Caspit he's very good, I think. I think for sure, now to take it beyond that, I think I think I'm worth reading. I think Michael Young is very good on Lebanon. I think Raghida Dergham, Dergham, who writes for The National, like me, but she's brilliant. She's really, really an important person to read and to listen to. And she's a weekly columnist and really great. Kim Gattas is absolutely great. on the region. I mean, I can keep going. There are a whole bunch of people.
You're not. I
All
don't
my
think Aaron
colleagues.
Mate is on your list.
No, I think he's a nut. I think he's a nut.
Right.
I think he's
I
absolutely,
agree.
he's totally nut. He's bonkers.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so same thing with Max
Yeah.
Blumenthal.
Yeah.
There are people who are just stuck in a narrative, right? A lot of people. Oh, let me throw out one to the mainstream. I think Tom Friedman's really good. He
Yeah.
has good,
Yeah.
he has good periods and bad
Yeah.
periods. Right now, he's acing it. Ever since the Gaza war began, he's been absolutely on point, without doubt at all. He's been great. So I would certainly do Friedman. Um, you know, there are so many more. Shannon Midham is excellent. Um, a lot of my colleagues at the Arab Gulf States Institute, they're all good. There's some really brilliant people out there.
Favorite books on the subject?
Yeah, The Iron Wall by Avi Schleim, The Iron Cage by Rashid Khalidi. The Some of the best stuff is archival stuff. So, before their diaspora by Walid Khalidi again, From Haven to Conquest, which is an indispensable collection of primary source material, going back to the earliest stages of the conflict, which has its deepest origins in the 1870s and 1880s. It has no origins beyond that. What people imagine is an ancient conflict, it is not. I'm talking about the very deepest roots, go back to like 1875 and things like that. So that's a very good source book on the conflict. Um, you know, uh, his, uh, also there are a lot of books that are sort of yeah, I think Edward Said's book, The Question of Palestine, is still really a really good one. And his essay, there's a book of photos called After the Last Sky. And Said has an essay at the beginning of that, which is just beautiful. It's really brilliant. Um, and I think that also, if you're interested in literature, there's a lot of good Jewish literature from Palestine from before the Israeli state, but I think the quality of the literature went down once the state was established because for many reasons, but one of them is that the Israelis having a state didn't need to imagine themselves into existence anymore. It had been done, whereas the Palestinians have had like the international standing of the PLO and a few diplomatic wins like that, and then their literature, and that's about it. And they're people worth reading, like Mahmoud Darwish is an amazing poet, and good in English translation, and certainly a bunch of the others are really great and very much worth reading. Well, I quite like Murid Barghouti, but also Hassan Kanafani. Hassan Kanafani is really interesting because his novels and poetry are full of humanity. And his political essays, especially the ones he wrote after he met George Habash and became part of the leadership of the PFLP, which was the most militant armed group, composed mainly of Palestinian Christians in the early 70s, and pioneered things like plane hijacking and things like that, spectacular stuff that they were doing. His political writing is quite extreme. And so it's a really interesting contrast between the way he lets his humanistic impulses soar in his art and kind of like stomps them down and buries them in his literary output, which is he has this famous saying, formerly famous, it's been forgotten, but it should be remembered. It's very interesting. He said, there can't be a dialogue with the Israelis. How can we have a dialogue with these people? It's like a dialogue between the sword and the neck. It's a beautiful image.
I've heard that
it's
one
also
before.
very extreme. Yeah, I mean, it's both a brilliant image and it's also a fairly extreme statement. Now, granted, he made this in the 60s and 70s, early 70s. He was sort of saying that before he was assassinated by Israel, and I think it's 73 or not, or whatever. Granted that the kind of zero-sum relationship was shared on both sides at that time, and that is a zero-sum, that is a quintessentially zero-sum statement. However, I would argue that its relevance is in its distillation of the mood of that people, their reaction to the dispossession and exile that was the result of 1947 and 48. And it's worth knowing about. There's no reason to shy away from it. So you've got to accept with Kanafani, a lot of people read. I've discovered by giving talks about Palestinian literature, and like I gave one at UMass earlier, Amherst, my alma mater, at the Complet department. I gave a public talk about this earlier this year, and a lot of people who specialize in modern Arabic literature and Palestinians were not familiar with Kanafani's political writing. They only knew his novels. So they had this image of him as this great humanistic figure. And I told them it's more complicated. You know, you're not wrong, but you're missing something that's really important, that's a bit different. And it has to do with the time, it has to do with circumstances, it has to do with the public way that people in general are reacting, the nature of the Israeli-Palestinian relationship at the time, etc. And they were sort of astounded that they just didn't know this. Anyway, Kanafani is great.
Hussein Ibish, you are a wealth of knowledge and humanity, and I can't thank you enough.
Oh, you're welcome. Yeah,
You've been so generous.